Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be with such diverse colleagues. This work that I'll talk about is done with my colleague Mike Power, who's a primatologist, evolutionary biologist over at the Smithsonian. And we have done sort of three projects that are related. I'll talk about one mainly today, mention a second, but not a third. But they're our trilogy. The first one is on obesity. The second one is on the origins of the placenta. And the third, which just came out, is on lactation. I am a whole body physiologist by training and trade. That is, we were brought up to think of many organs working together to maintain stability, or what I like to call viability, because homeostasis varies depending upon the context, depending upon what's available, and depending on your capabilities and what your life cycle age stability is like. So it's a lifelong endeavor that begins early. And obesity is a common topic. It's one of the afflictions of our age. You know, like smoking, it's actually one that shouldn't be so hard to do away with and is not so hard to understand. And it's perhaps not even a new phenomenon, you know, in principle. You know, there are indications that it's been around for a while. And although rare, because it's a condition of luxury, right? Most never lived that long, let alone had an opportunity to get heavy. Next slide, please. But it's not new. It's just way more common now. And with that common theme becomes, have the next slide, please, its expression. Our culture, and I'm not going to talk in here today, but we can talk in the groups about the variation in body weight and obesity across cultures. You know, we are a fattening culture. And I always like to say that, and I don't know how many people here read the Institute of Medicine report on body weight, but I always like to distinguish body weight absolutes, you know, from to include also considerations about exercise. You know, they sort of take body weight as an abstraction, and they take the lifestyle kind of out of it. You can get a lean, mean machine that does no exercise, and you can get somebody that's slightly zoptic, that's a little bit heavy, to use a Yiddish word, and they're quite capable and live long lives. But obesity is our affliction, America's affliction. And it's more expressed in some places more than others. And it's, no question, becoming much more dominant in our children. It just doesn't begin in childhood, it begins before that, and I'll mention that in a wee bit. But we all know how dominant it is in our culture. I could have the next slide, please. You know, with that comes a whole lot of modern afflictions, not just modern, but it's just more dominant. Anybody can get type 2 diabetes if you live long enough. There are just many ways to exaggerate the vulnerability. And the interesting thing, which is not up there, there's been an exaggeration now of type 1 adult onset diabetes. So you're just magnifying what we call risk factors, you know, and of which there are many, most of which are not understood and most of which are not given a value, that is, giving a value to those variables. But this is a common list that's related to increases in obesity. And this is not all of them either. And you know, you can turn it around, you know, some people get depressed and they might get obese because they are depressed. So it's a many-directional way of thinking, or one should, about the links between these. But this is a common list, and only a small subset of it. And when you put this together in the context of public health and monetary issues, it's a sad fact about our culture that something that, in principle, could be eliminated can dominate this much. The next one. And this is just on the diabetes side, type 2 diabetes. the growth of it. Next slide, please. Now, since we wrote a book on obesity, part of our book was not just about the pathology, but regulation. So I've always thought as a regulatory physiologist, we're kind of mini engineers. We're looking for as many biological factors as we can think about. And when we think we understand something, we're looking to show how they interact, both how they operate locally and how they operate together, both on the short term and the long term. So the first thing is always to try to understand, well, how does something actually work? And believe me, in the last 100 years, of course, systems, end organ systems, we know a lot about how the adrenal gland, the thyroid gland, or the diverse endocrine systems, let alone intracellular systems that underlie that. But one system that operates is the social context. And any consideration for understanding something like obesity and our vulnerability to it has to be put in a context of we often eat together. At least that's what it evolved for us in many contexts. Next slide, please. This age, how much can I stuff in my mouth really fast? How much do I dilute the social context? Preparing, cooking, coordinating, collaborating, cajoling, participating, cleaning, and the rest. You put that together with endless junk, with systems that are ready to absorb, digest, redistribute, dilute, excrete, it's not hard to understand. Understanding here doesn't mean that you have a treatment. I've lived long enough to see that when the last peptide, and I've studied many of them over the years, comes up, say like one that you might be familiar with, leptin, the first reflex is I now have the appetite controller, only to discover it wasn't like that, not by itself. Now, in rare occasions it is, but it's rare. The dominant one is it's not by itself. It's in coordination with many other systems. But the vulnerability to obesity in a culture that has endless junk, that's not so hard to understand. And where the social context, and where you live longer. Next slide, please. A little bit of biology. In any form of our ancestors, I don't think obesity was a very dominant issue. So it is, even though you can show a slide from 20,000 years ago and you can show some from a couple hundred years ago, it's more modern than anything else, and it isn't in the past. And again, I want to emphasize here the social context, because I don't think enough consideration highlights that. We are a social species. Can I have the next slide, please? So these are just some fairly common sense ways of thinking about environments for which obesity can just get facilitated really fast. Soft drinks, endless eating outside the home. And of course, as a biologist, I never separate biology and culture. Culture is an expression of biology. The other continuity between our cultural expressions and our biological capabilities. They're not separate for me and the way I think about it, including issues on the socioeconomic side. So I had a student years ago, African-American woman, who really said, look, skinny white women is one thing. African-Americans' body weight conception is very, very different. The issue is, when does it become not healthy, right? In the African-American community, there's a 3-to-1 vulnerability to preterm low birth weight babies, to preeclampsia, to thyroid. When is that trade-off? And I don't even like that language here. Not the right thing, right? But these are just some of the very common sense, but common sense based on data. Next slide, please. This is just to refresh you, of the diverse forms of what I've often called information molecules. To remind people here that they might not know, vitamin D is actually a steroid hormone. It's not a vitamin. My mind has turned to it over the years for lots of reasons. But all kinds of tissue in the body produce these information molecules. So the skin, for instance, produces vitamin D, which is a steroid, but it also produces the whole hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. You can find the migration of these information molecules across all kinds of end organ systems that are both in the brain and outside the brain. Get the next slide, please. Now, one of the ones that sort of comes up in the context of body weight and food intake, of course, is the gut-brain peptides. In the 1980s and 1990s, but 80s more than anything, there was a revolution in peptide discovery. And peptides are just strings of amino acids. Cytokines, inflammatory signals, are peptides. And it's a very nominal distinction between what we call cytokines and what we call peptide hormones. I think of them all common, and they often have similar functions. But all these gut peptides, of which cholecystokinin might be one that you would have known, or leptin is another. Leptin's a little more complicated. Ghrelin, and there's probably 25 of them. This is just a small subset. We don't know their diverse roles. We're still in search for them. And every once in a while, you think you're lucky. You think, well, leptin's tied to fat metabolism. We were spoiled earlier with the pancreas because insulin is one of the instances that's fairly well known. And in my career, I've been one of those people that kind of seized on what's known, and sort of targeted it to take it as far as I could, where you could find it. Insulin lends itself to that because it's so tightly linked to glucose metabolism. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is just a cartoon, really to say that information molecules, in this case like leptin or insulin, they're both in the periphery and they're in the brain. And it's a continuous function for how they interact. And one thing to note, just as for your memory of physiology here, is that peptides that are produced in the periphery, like insulin, are usually kept out of the brain. And so, with such a thing called as a blood-brain barrier, we now know that blood-brain barrier is way more porous, and in fact, the blood-brain barrier is itself a regulatory organ. It varies depending on what the condition is. So obesity can impact the blood-brain barrier, so that many of these peptides in the periphery have greater access to the brain. It happens during pregnancy. It might happen during lactation. Again, thinking blood-brain barrier is a concept. How do you know there's a blood-brain barrier? You don't see a wall. You radioligand a molecule and you find out that it's not quite getting in, but it's porous and it's regulatory. The way of thinking about the body here is how it regulates in context and how it restores itself. And that's partly what you meant by homeostasis, And it is a lot anticipatory when you get to a certain level and when you get to these complex systems. Come next slide, please. Now, one phrase that a lot of us, particularly on the brain sciences, is a phrase that actually comes from Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov is often associated with a narrow form of learning theory, but he actually was a GI physiologist. That's what he got his Nobel Prize for, which was on what's called the gastric fistula, where you put a substance in the oral cavity and you separate the oral cavity, what goes on in the GI tract. That was what his Nobel Prize was for. But he was very keyed into what he called cephalic phase, the anticipatory responses that we have, like to a social environment, and how our physiology gets ready to do X, Y, and Z. And of course, that varies quite a lot. In the context of food, a whole lot of steps happen. These are just some of the molecules that are involved, and these are some of the functions that are involved. Now, for each of that, it'd be nice to be an engineer here, And in fact, we are trying to be engineers. We're just reversing what we're trying to do here. You know? Got the next slide, please. I want to just point out to you, you eat a sandwich, you release insulin. Now, sandwiches hopefully is nutritive. You release insulin. Now next slide, please. You go to something that's not, has any nutrients in it, like saccharin. Saccharin is a fake sweet. So those substances for which our biology is geared in a very imperfect way, right, to redistribute, to digest, to reabsorb, insulin is also being secreted here to something that's a fake sweet. That's just only one instance of which there are many, many. Now, what you want to do now, which we do, you focus on how that works. But you focus on how that works, you have to keep an eye on many other systems that are impacted. The next slide, please. Growing phenomena, no question about it. Next slide, please. Now moving to the second phase real fast. Placenta. Every information molecule of every end organ system in the body is produced in the placenta. Right? So just imagine every chemical in the body is right there. Its impact is long, including oxytocin, leptin, vasopressin. Next slide, please. This is just some of the changes in the placenta through these information molecules, like cytokines. But taking the placenta into account here is also an issue in a growing population where obesity matters. Next slide, please. Inflammation. I never like the phrase, some people think of pregnancy as an inflammatory state. I'm quite uncomfortable with that. You know, you throw out a term like inflammation. It's like throwing out a term like metabolism. You mean, what exactly do you mean? Next slide, please. It just shows the increase in the placenta. There's no question, the placenta is growing. Next slide, please. Same sort of thing about changes in body weight. Next slide, please. Coming to the end. If you're sitting around and you're not outside, you know, it's pretty easy to see the slide downward, right? You get systems, take your metaphor here, that are up to the edge, you know, in greater capability. And the slide downward is fairly fast. Next slide, please. Decreases, the social side of it all, decreases in recreation, you know, not hard to understand. Next slide, please. This is my old mentor, Elliot Steller, who somebody in the room knows. You know, one of his slides, you know. Now, I was part of his group. This is, you know, we were on the brain side of it all. And that's what we studied. It's what I studied for lots of years and still do. But it's a social context for understanding. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the...
I can hear you nicely.
My question is about how maternal obesity negatively impacts breastfeeding. What is going on with the lactation system? Because the obese mom generally has a lot of fat tissue, you know, which is in the breasts. Does that impact the hormones, the function of the ducts? What's happening there with to impair breastfeeding?
I could speculate because I wish I knew the answer. You know, I could speculate. I don't think we really have a good answer for that. I'd like to have an answer for you, but I'd just be making it up.
No, I'm working on that too.
Yeah, well, I would appreciate any insight you might have. Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered if you
Yeah.
know, since you've written a book on obesity,
Yeah.
and you also are so interested in the placenta,
Yeah.
did you have any insights, and I'm sure you know about the fetal causes of adult disease,
Yeah.
ideas connecting the chronic diseases of obesity with fetal and maternal nutrition. Do you have any insights about why it does anything that, I mean, from what you know about the placenta?
Yep. Well, I mean, the way, and here, you know, information molecules during fetal development, and the insulin and its effects on the fetal, we know some of the effects that are occurring from the placenta, from information molecules being produced in the placenta, impacting fetal physiology being non-trivially for changing putatively diverse forms of set points, or facilitating the maturation, or delaying certain systems, or producing a disorder. We know now almost any information molecule that we know of is being impacted. Vitamin D is one, the steroid, the whole range of steroids. But the peptides are all being changed. CRH is another one that's being changed in that phenomenon. Yeah.
So are you suggesting that there are lasting, because the problem is that the effects, whatever happens in the fetal stage, persist throughout life somehow?
Yeah, I go back to organizational changes as a function of the release of these peptide information molecules that last way longer than their initial release.
So you think that set points are altered during the fetal stage?
Not always comfortable with the language of set points, but that's a trivial thing here. The physiology's changed, and it's altered. And it's not just one direction. It's not just thinking, well, it's higher. You know, I think the data is there on that. And we know just it's a lifetime change. Now, having said that, you know, I never underestimate the ability to adapt, you know, to minimize. And it depends which system you're talking about. But re-envisioning the placenta, way different from this passive organ as was perceived still about 10 or 15 years ago. It's a very active organ. And that relationship, the tripart relationship, is real and long-lasting.
All right, I think we have one more question.
Hi, I'm just curious about the effects of changes in the microbiome. What your knowledge is about the gut barrier and the hormones and so
We're looking at it like, you know, golly, how many bugs can you have in your tummy? You know, let me count the ways. You know, who knew there was some? The issue for trying to figure this out is there are good bugs that are just working for you. There are bugs there that are benign, don't mean anything. And what's the subset of bugs that are not good? Right? Right now, it's kind of, you know, in the context, there may be some systems that you can get at. But right now, the microbiome is a metaphor for a bug-related universe, of which a lot are benign, most are, you know, are not are might even be positive, and what's the subset that's negative, and very little is known there. I mean, to be frank with you, but it's a wonderful area of research, and it sort of highlights just how, you know, what is the gut but those organs? What are those organs but end organ systems? What's embedded in those end organ systems but these diverse information molecules? What impacts these information molecules? Many things, of which bugs in your tummy is a metaphor here, is one amongst many. You're welcome.